All right, so I think we're recording right now.
Sweet.
I'm joined by Jeff. We're going to talk about MCP servers and Clerk support for MCP servers to make authentication easier when you want to allow access to LLM applications to use your users' data. So, Jeff, I'll hand it over to you. I'll interrupt you when I had questions, so feel free to share a screen and take me over. Maybe you can start from what MCP servers are and
Mhm.
this new protocol, MCP, and then we take it into authentication and how it ties into Clerk.
Yeah, for sure. So MCP in general, broadly, is a way that AI applications can be given permission by users who are using them to access certain like private details that they otherwise wouldn't have access to effectively without your permission. For example, if you were trying to use, ChatGPT or Claude or Cursor or any of the other sort of AI applications to, let's say, go through your email and find an email that, like, maybe the two of us exchanged 2 years ago about, some library I was working on because we did that maybe. Normally, it would take me a while to like go and like load up Gmail and like just start, typing in like phrases and typing in your name and seeing what I could turn up. And that's like the type of task that I feel like is pretty useful to use AI for, is like, just find this for me because it's a bunch of grunt work and it can scan through a bunch of data really quickly, and take some pretty good guesses. If there was a MCP connection between, let's just say for this example, Claude, and Google, that allowed Claude to access your Gmail data, the AI would then be able to actually do that. Whereas otherwise, if you just load up Claude out of the gate, and ask it to search in your emails, it doesn't have access to your emails, which is good because that would be a big problem for everyone else using Claude who can now read your emails. And so, in order to make that happen, there needs to be like a protocol where both the AI application and Google are speaking the same language and can like make an exchange and get the user's permission to access that data, in order for that to be able to happen. And so that is at base what MCP is, broadly. I have like a little diagram that I can maybe show here that's sitting in one of the readmes of our MCP tools repositories, for like how this looks generally in reality, which is like, imagine you're on Claude, you're in their settings, you wanted to add an integration with Gmail, but have some sort of button that you can click. And perhaps you've actually done this because this is something that Claude supports. It will then open a screen on Google saying, hey, Claude wants to access your Gmail. It wants to be able to do these things. You say that's okay with me or that's not okay with me. And then once, if assuming that you do say it's okay because that was your intention, you can then go into Claude and say, hey, go find something for me. And it will do what's called making a tool call, in which case it makes a request out to Google to say, hey, my user would like to, you know, call this API endpoint. And you typically have to approve that in the AI chat application. Once you approve it, it will go make the call, get the data, and come back and tell you what you're looking for. So this is a really useful thing in general because it expands the capabilities of AI like very dramatically, primarily in the like sort of personal assistant like space. And there were already a lot of companies trying to like leverage AI, apps as personal assistants, even before MCP was created. And this really brings it to a whole different level, because AI is really useful at like taking care of things for you. I was just talking to my wife the other day about this, and she was like, man, I'm like really grateful for AI and like looking up this like specific law about like renting houses because we like have this house that we rent, and we had to like do some research on it. And it's like, I remember like how long it would have taken to like Google all the parts of this law and like what you can say and what you can't say and like what the pieces of it are, and like you'd have to probably go to a bunch of different sources, and like now I can just ask AI and it just gives me answers. um, and it's really nice for that type of thing, for like doing research or like taking care of trivial tasks. It's a little bit worse at doing like big, complicated things because it's not super trustworthy. But in the realm of personal assistance, like it can thrive. So you can say, go, look through my emails, find this email that, find any email that I exchanged with anybody about MCP in the last 3 months, because I've been working on this at Clerk and I've been talking to a bunch of customers about it, and compile the like feedback, and then go and like go to Figma through MCP and like design a nice email template that's branded with Clerk branding, and have it like write out like a thank you note to all the people who gave me feedback, and then run that by me and I'll check it. And then if I approve it, then send it out to all the people who I talked to through my Gmail account. And it could like do all of those things, right? Which is really cool. And effectively, the sky is the limit with this sort of thing. It just depends on who has support for MCP and what types of flows you can think of that it can run through there. But it really just opens up a whole new world of like things that AI apps can do and data that they can access, which is really exciting development in the world of AI in general. Sorry for going on for so long about this.
No, 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 not at all. So, as I understand, MCP is just a standard way of you providing more tools and resources to the LLM, because you give more context to it via these tools, and MCP is just a standardizing the way, or creating a unified protocol for all the applications to now give their tools and resources to LLM-based applications, which opens up
Yeah,
different use cases for the LLM applications. And then you mentioned that when you are dealing with private data, you want scoped permissions. So it's not all
exactly.
the tools and resources, but you want to authenticate so that it only has access to the logged in user. So it only has access to my emails if I'm
Right.
connecting my Gmail. That's where the authentication part comes in.
Yeah, and this is like the critical piece of MCP is that exact thing. The reason that it's useful, like by default, you go to an LLM app and it has access to kind of like everything that it could find on the internet, which is cool. But it doesn't have access to anything that it can find that's in one of your accounts on any of the services, hundreds of services that you have accounts on. So the critical pivot point is that like it can ask for your permission to access stuff that's in your account. You say yes, and now that is available to it as context. But as you're saying, like that permission accessing piece is like a pure auth concern. And so this is something that we've been thinking about and dealing with a lot recently at Clerk.
All right. Okay, so now when we're talking about authentication and Clerk support for this MCP integration, we're thinking through the lens of I have an application, so I'm an application builder, and I want to give my users the ability so that they can pull in their data in my application into their LLM application of their choice. Like, let's say they're working with Claude
Mhm,
and they want to pull in their information from my application. So that's the
mhm.
perspective that we're going about. So
Yes.
I have an application, users logged into it, they have different information on it. Now I want to give them access to be able to work with those data outside of my application.
Yeah, so this this is where we start getting down the twisted rabbit hole. Um, there's sort of like two base layers of like how MCP could apply to Clerk. And you've identified one of them, which is if you are a developer who is building an application with Clerk, so you're building a weather application, right? Because there's not enough of those on the internet. And you want to make sure that your users can go to Claude and ask Claude to get info about the weather without having to go to your app and sign in and see all the stuff if that's how they want to access your app. You would want to have that capability. And since Clerk is handling your authentication, Clerk also is responsible for handling this handshake via MCP between these two third parties. The protocol through which that handshake happens is called OAuth, and OAuth is one protocol layer underneath MCP. So, as I was saying, we're really starting to go down the rabbit hole a little bit here. Please stop me at any point if you want me to go deeper on any of these things. But like OAuth is this protocol that MCP is built on top of that is meant for pretty much exactly what this transaction is, which is like when you have two different applications that want permission from the user to share data from one application to another. OAuth is a protocol for dealing with that. And OAuth has been around for a really long time. I think it was made in 2012, 2013. So it's been around for well over a decade at this point. Well, a little bit over a decade. But it's like very solid. And I think we've all probably dealt with OAuth at some point in our internet usage, if not in our code writing, which I think is a little bit less frequent. And I think the most common indicator that you're dealing with OAuth is when you see something that we refer to as a consent screen, which is that thing we were talking about earlier. X application wants to access your details on Y. Sometimes a list of ability to read your posts or make posts on your behalf, and then you hit accept. Even when you're signing into one app through a different one, like sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, that also uses the OAuth protocol because you're making a connection of sharing your email address and maybe your profile picture and maybe your name with this application in order for you to sign in and create an account. So I'd be very surprised if anyone at this company or anyone listening to us chat hasn't encountered OAuth one way or another. And this fits exactly the scheme of what you're trying to do with MCP, which is a handshake with the user's permission between two third-party applications to do some amount of data sharing. So OAuth is the base layer. On top of that is MCP, which is here's the format that the LLM is going to ask for the information in, and here's a format that you can give the information to the LLM in that it is able to understand and utilize effectively. And that's what you're ultimately using here if you are building an app. And so Clerk handles the OAuth for you because Clerk is your auth provider, and part of auth is OAuth. And then you should be able to kind of just make that connection out of the box. And we generally think this is really important. This is the first thing we tackled in the MCP work because we believe that it will become a table stakes requirement for applications to have MCP integrations. We're not so extreme that we believe that nobody's going to use dashboards anymore, or the internet's going to be useless and everyone's going to be doing everything over AI. I mean, maybe that's the case, but that's not, that's not where we're coming from this from. Generally, the stance is it's going to be a way that people sometimes will want to interact with your application. Sometimes they might go to your dashboard, sometimes they may log into and use your app directly, but oftentimes they may also want to pull in some information or context that they have built within your app into some workflow that they're running in an AI application. And we feel like this is going to become the expectation for users, and therefore it's going to become a requirement for any app that anybody's building to have this type of endpoint. Which is a big shuffle because there wasn't really a need for this previously, right? There are some apps like, Facebook, Twitter, Google, usually big social media centric apps or single sign-on centric apps that had already built out OAuth infrastructure and had this already ready. And so layering MCP on top of that was a pretty light lift because most of MCP auth is just having implemented OAuth. But for most applications, especially most startups, and I would venture to guess probably the vast majority of folks using Clerk, they probably don't have an OAuth service in their app because there wasn't really any need for it. And so this requirement introduces two needs. One is you need to have an OAuth provider, which is a fairly substantial project that is also very security sensitive. There have been tons of instances where OAuth has been used to take over users' accounts or phish users. You have to be very careful about it. And then also on top of that, the MCP protocol needs to be ironed out. And our goal was to say, if you're using Clerk, you don't have to worry about any of that anymore. It's already done for you. We've put in the work. We've thought about the security. We have support for the protocol. We have example apps that show a working MCP service. We have example apps that show a working OAuth service. And if you're using us for auth, you get a fully functional OAuth provider out of the box that you can use for any reason that you want. You can use it for MCP. You can use it for other things, like Facebook uses it for sharing their data with other apps. But it's there for you because we're an auth company and we build auth products. And I don't think that's super unique to Clerk, by the way, by any means. I think any modern auth provider will also give you a similar thing. But that was our first goal, is to say, if you're building an app with Clerk, we give you OAuth, and you can use that to build an MCP integration. there is another layer, which is like, I want to use MCP to interact with Clerk itself, right? So like I'm using AI to build an application with Clerk, and I want to say to Claude, can you go and like change my Clerk app settings so that you like allow people to sign in with GitHub, you know? And in theory, that should be possible if Clerk itself has an MCP service that allows AI to interact with it. Or you could say, I'm building an application with Clerk. Can you make me like 10 test users with like X, Y, or Z metadata so that I can like use it for my unit tests or whatever? And I think either one of those examples are pretty reasonable use cases. I'm sure we'll see way more. So there's the customers of Clerk are able to build MCP services for their apps, MCP project. And then there's the Clerk has an MCP service for itself project, if that makes any sense. And
Yeah,
those two are
absolutely.
very easy to mix up, but like I wanted to belabor the like separation between them here just for
Yeah.
clarity.
No, absolutely. Um, I got the idea of the first use case being that you're building any application and you want to have MCP to provide MCP
Uh,
integration for your app so your
yeah,
users can access their data from anywhere from your app, from their
correct.
LLM based applications. And the second use case is that Clerk would also have provide this MCP connection or service so that you can interface with your Clerk account, your organizations, your
Yes,
settings and whatnot
exactly.
to be able to control that via your another LLM application. So
So use
um,
case one is out and supported. Use case
mhm.
two is not out yet, but we are working on it. And there's like a little interesting architectural detail of this distinction that I can dive into if you want, or if you have other things you want to ask about, that's fine too.
um, I think the first use case, at least for now, would be what developers would use the most, in that
Yes.
I'm building an app and everybody talks about MCP, so I want to have that integration to also advertise that my app, whatever it is, has that MCP integration. But before we get into the details of that and what goes into building an MCP server and how Clerk comes in there, um, I want to clarify something. I don't know if I understood it correctly or not. Um, you mentioned OAuth is a layer beneath
Uh,
MCP and MCP sits on top of it. So you have this scoped permission mechanism to access user
correct.
data in different apps, and MCP sits on top of it to get that uh, permission and then access tools and resources from the user's account.
Yes.
Now, can we also use MCP, or at least my understanding was that we can use MCP without auth. So imagine there's an app out there that, I don't know, talks about real estate properties in a specific state, and it just wants to have an MCP server
Yep.
so people can just go in Claude and say, show me homes in near me.
Yep.
And they don't necessarily want to have scoped permission access and whatnot. And that's
Totally.
still using the MCP protocol to communicate between that Claude chat application and the provider, the server being that real estate company.
Yes, totally possible. In the same way that you could build an API without auth. I think most APIs that you end up interacting with as a developer have some form of auth protection. But there are plenty of, companies that will build an API that doesn't require auth because it's like a public data resource. I think at one point back in the days of Twitter, they had a open API for just pulling tweets or like searching for tweets about a topic that didn't require you to sign in and provide auth. And there's plenty of other examples like the ones you mentioned. It's
Mhm.
also possible that you have an MCP service where some of it requires auth and some of it does not require auth.
Mhm.
For example, maybe you'd want to create an account, and for creating an account, you wouldn't need auth because that doesn't make any sense. You don't have an account yet, so how how would that be possible? But once you've created an account, it opens up several endpoints, edit your account details, uploading profile picture, whatever. That would be behind auth because obviously you don't want anybody to be able to make those changes.
Mhm.
So it's very, very similar to APIs in that way. I think it's actually very similar to APIs in a lot of different ways. The main difference is just that I guess, like I've asked this question on several occasions myself. I was like, what's stopping LLMs from just using APIs? Like, why do we need a separate protocol for this? I think generally the answer is like, they can't really figure out how to use APIs yet, right? Like it's as a developer, you like read documentation and you like build a plan for what you want to do, and then you go to the API endpoints and you like develop like a scheme for like I'm going to call this one and this one, this one, and get this data and like wire this into that thing. It seems like LLMs are not reliable enough to do that successfully, consistently. And so when you expose an MCP service, you are sort of like wrapping an extra layer around what is probably a set of underlying API endpoints, but one that is more tailored to like a use case. Rather than like with an API endpoint, there's like a list users endpoint or something like that, right? With MCP, maybe you do provide a list users if that's like a thing that people might want to do, but you'd also want to be thinking about like what are the goals of the people that are trying to use your service, and expose an endpoint or a tool in the case of MCP, right? Because an API endpoint and a tool are effectively equivalent. That like does the whole thing. And that tool may end up calling 5 or 6 other tools as part of its process. Like you might be saying, hey, like something went wrong with my Clerk app. Can you figure out what it is? And then there might be multiple tools. It's like search through your logs, find if there are issues, like now go get a list of users to narrow it down because we found an issue with this user, like, get that user's metadata and then like print it out and say, hey, we found some issue with this user's metadata or something like that. But like that's very different from calling an API endpoint for reasons that are obvious, right? Like it's more of like a holistic type of human facing, like full blown, this is a problem I have and I want you to solve this problem type of thing, rather than a very granular list of endpoints. And there was sort of this explosion of companies when MCP was starting to come out that would like take your open API spec and just turn each one of your API endpoints into MCP endpoints for money. And I think we're starting to see a decline in that because people have realized like, why would we have had, why would MCP exist at all if it's literally just like a slightly differently formatted wrapper over your API endpoints? At that point, you may as well just give your API to the LLM. But that's not really the goal. It's a little bit different. And so, we're early days. We're all still kind of like trying to figure this out, auth included. Like there are multiple changes to the auth spec that have landed within the last month, major breaking changes. There are multiple additional changes that are still coming down the pipes. Support is all over the place. Implementation's all over the place. I was the one working on this project at Clerk, so I experienced it very much firsthand. I implemented a server and it worked in these 3 popular clients and it didn't work in these 2 because they had a different interpretation of this or that. So like to add to
Still
this,
early
like we
days.
are very early on and like it's not stable. And I think it will stabilize obviously over the course of the next several months or years. But like there are a lot of different ideas about how this works and how to use it effectively and what you should do with different parts of it. And I think the number of super authoritative answers that are sitting on the table is not super high. We're like kind of in an experimental phase of this tech at the moment. But we are starting to move towards some answers because we're testing it. Like we are now able to make MCP servers with auth and use them. And as you go through and use them, you can make a call of like, hey, is this helpful? Or is it like not really helpful? Is AI leveraging this to get to answers? Or is it kind of like blundering around and like hallucinating?
I like this idea that you mentioned. The MCP is not really um, against or as opposed to APIs, but they
Yeah,
work in conjunction. There's like different
right.
layers. Underneath an MCP server, a tool call might use a couple of APIs, but
Yes.
it's just a way uh, to connect to the LLM-based applications, and so that they can say, all right, what are your hey server, what are your capabilities? What can you do? And
Right.
that comes back and says, I have these tools, I have these resources, you can do this stuff. And then once necessary, it makes that tool call. Now that server underneath might actually be calling APIs to return the response for that
I
specific
think
tool call. So
oftentimes
it's
it will be, right? Like, and this is an interesting piece of it that I could go into if you want. don't want to cut you off, but like, yeah, I think frequently this is what's happening is that you have your API as like this granular base layer, and then you have your MCP implementation on top of it, which you do have to think about specifically because it operates differently, even if it ends up delegating under the hood to either directly your API routes or internally the exact same logic that is running those API routes. There's no reason to duplicate it, right? If you have a list users API route, then there's no reason to like copy paste your list users code into a list users MCP tool, right? That's probably a bad pattern because you make one change to one of them, now the other one's broken, right? I think you generally want to be like literally directly delegating under the hood into the API endpoints themselves. It's just a matter of figuring out how you assemble those together into like dedicated workflows.
Okay, so I think we got enough clarification on what MCPs are. Why would you want to use them? And if we are diving deeper into the first use case where I'm a developer, I'm building an application, or I already have an application and I want to have MCP integration. So I need to have this MCP server so that it can host requests coming in from LLM-based applications. And I want to authenticate so that users can access their data. This is where Clerk comes in to access that authentication. I know we have this support for Next.js currently applications to build
Yep.
an MCP server to then host as tools.
Yeah, so we do have support for everything. What we have for Next.js specifically is a example implementation and a step-by-step guide in our docs on how to get it working. I have been into the weeds with all of the other frameworks and tools and have like proof of concepts of the fact that it will work. So like what Clerk is able to provide right now, you can make this work anywhere. What I would like though is to have the same thing for Next.js as for all of our other frameworks. Like I don't want to like announce, hey, we can support MCP for Remix and not say, here's an example implementation and here's a step-by-step guide on how to exactly do it. Because if we announce that, then people are just be like, okay, how do we do it? If you're really in the weeds and you understand how MCP works and you understand how OAuth works, you would be able to get there. So I guess it's a kind of complicated distinction. Like I have been in the weeds with MCP and OAuth, which is why I'm putting these examples together. It's just a matter of like me having the time available to dedicate to saying like I build and release this example, I build and release this one, and we're kind of just going down the line from most to least popular of the SDK integrations that we have with Clerk and just churning out these like more dedicated examples. But that being said, for anyone who doesn't have one available or isn't using Next.js, there's nothing stopping you from making a functional MCP server at the moment other than just having to put together the pieces.
All right. Should we dive into our uh, maybe setting up? I have one project set up and I've
Mhm.
tried to play around with the MCP. Maybe I can share my screen and kind of
Yeah,
walk over that implementation
sure.
to
Let's
see
do
it in
it.
details. All right. So let me share my screen here.
While you're getting into that, I just want to briefly mention because it's on topic with the stuff that we were talking about before. That like I feel like there is going to be like a set of like realizations that companies come to as they start implementing MCP, which is that like they need to have some form of like management API for things, right? And it's like you may have a dashboard for your app, and that dashboard may just do the logic that it needs to do on your backend, and that's it. And that would be a very normal way to build a dashboard. But if you're trying to expose an MCP service, you kind of need to have APIs for those things, or at least like very clear functions that execute each one of those things that you're comfortable with being accessible to the outside world via OAuth tokens rather than like directly through user requests that come in through your dashboard. And I think this is something that folks are going to have to start grappling with as well as they start building out MCP services. Like if you have a very comprehensive developer facing API that covers all functionality in your platform, it's a little bit easier. But for a lot of companies, they don't have that. They might not have an API at all. They might have a limited API that just covers some operations. But if you want to open up the MCP, you may also have to consider within the architecture of your app, do you need to make any changes? Because there's like a whole new vertical through which users are interacting with your platform that you might not have thought about or like built for specifically. And so that might require some like architectural shifts or discussions, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Probably a positive thing, but it does add a little bit of extra burden. It's easy to build out an example, right? And I assume that's probably what we're going to go through is building out an example to show how it can work end to end and it's helpful. But if you're talking about like, I have an existing app, I've got a startup, I want to build out MCP, there is this additional layer of like, how am I going to share my logic of the tasks that I want to be accomplishable through MCP with the logic and the way that it's been written into whatever UI people can accomplish it through at the moment. I know that's kind of vague, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about.
No, no, absolutely. I think that's it's such an important point, because when you are thinking about sharing resources or tools within your application now for this new AI interface, but maybe you don't even have those APIs built in. So there
Exactly.
are those architectural designs that you need to put in place before you're able to build that MCP. Maybe this is the last
Right.
piece of the puzzle to just wrap it in a server, enable authentication, and boom, there you go. So
Exactly.
there a lot
Yes.
goes into it before you're able to actually get to that point.
Yeah. And I think that that's an important part of the discussion. If you are thinking about, hey, I think we should build out an MCP service for our app, it's not just, it's easy to watch a demo of somebody doing it and be like, oh, yeah, this will be easy. We'll give the developer 2 or 3 days to do it. But I think realistically, what you'll find out is like it might require a little bit more thought and deliberation to get there.
Absolutely. Okay, so for folks watching, if this goes on YouTube. So there is documentation around the new feature that has been shipped in supporting MCP servers. So let's go here where we're trying to build an MCP server in our Next.js application, and we want to enable authentication through Clerk to give users access to their data. Basically, that's what we're trying to do here. I'm starting off with a Clerk authentication starter. There's going to be a video on the channel where I walk you through this, setting up Clerk authentication, like this is starter package through the Vercel integration, which is very easy, but we're not going to dive into that now. I'm assuming that you have a Clerk enabled Next.js app, and we just want to expose this MCP server and build authentication into it. So the first step, and stop me, Jeff, anytime
Mm-hmm.
that I'm
Yep.
so installing the dependencies, the first thing is this MCP adapter. And my understanding is that this is a wrapper around. Is this the wrapper around? No, it's not the MCP TypeScript SDK. It's just a way for handling requests and authentication for your
Yeah.
MCP
So
endpoint.
the MCP adapter is something that was built out of Vercel for handling the MCP protocol itself through Next.js. I personally spent a lot of time working with Vercel on this, going back and forth with them to get this adapter into the place where it is. I think they did a great job with it. Regardless of whether you're using Clerk or another auth provider, if you're trying to put MCP endpoint into your Next.js app, this is probably the way to go. Not every framework has a tool like this. For the frameworks that don't have tools like this, I've been building out adapters from Clerk that you can use. I did so actually initially for Vercel as well, but they were really interested in pushing this forward and they ended up building out their own version that sort of like merged in a bunch of the code that I've been working on. And so that was great in my book. The general reason behind why you need this is that MCP doesn't use normal HTTP. It has like a separate like streamable HTTP protocol that it uses that's different, and it uses this JSON RPC format, which is also kind of unusual. And at times it uses a format called server sent events, which is also unusual. And so, like figuring out how all those things work and coercing your request and response objects into the format that it needs to be in order to work with the protocol is like kind of a pain, to be honest. And so
And
that's
that's
what
what
this
this
adapter takes care
adapter
of.
is.
It like
Okay.
gives you in a Next.js app a way that you could take a regular API endpoint, wrap this adapter around it. And for you as a developer, what happens is it looks like it's working normally, like you would with any other API endpoint. But in reality, what Vercel is doing with this adapter under the hood is like coercing all these different protocols into something that fits the way that you expect an API like request response cycle to go normally in Next.js. If that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have the Clerk MCP tools, which is a wrapper around the MCP TypeScript SDK. This is an SDK from uh,
Anthropic.
the yeah Anthropic, this model context
Yep.
protocol. There's like I see that there's a website also, a community built around the MCP and the different SDKs that they have.
Yes.
And this is for providing Clerk OAuth with MCP.
Yeah. So the MCP SDKs themselves are very low level, and they are not very well documented, to be honest. Although they're great. And at Clerk, we're like really very passionate about having things that are not very low level and are very well documented. And so, in order to like cover for this, MCP Tools sits on top and makes it easy to use things. If you want to go see what it's doing, MCP Tools is open source. You can click that link right there and go look at the source code. There's a whole bunch of crazy OAuth stuff going on. If you go click on server.ts up there, you can sort of see what's happening. It's not it's not too crazy, but like you generally just have to have dived really deep into the way that authentication OAuth works in order to make it work correctly. And this just does that work for you, which is nice. And makes it so that you can sort of implement an MCP service if you're using Clerk, or honestly, if you're using anything else. This has Clerk specific utilities, which are even more abbreviated and have an even better DX because we can make certain assumptions about how the auth service works because it's specifically made for Clerk. But it also includes auth provider agnostic utilities. So it's like layered in that way. Like at base, MCP tools will work with anything. And on top of that base, we have like Clerk specific utilities that like are require even less parameters or are even smoother to use because we can fill in the gaps a little bit.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so that's what this library is doing. If we reach a future where this goes away because the official SDKs are good enough, I'd also be pleased about that. But we're early days for MCP, as mentioned before, so we're doing our best to like create a smooth, even, reasonable experience for our users that makes it easy to set up and it works across all providers. And in this case, it required us to put a little bit of a layer on top.
Correct. So we installed these two dependencies that helps us deal with the requests coming in from MCP servers and clients in the different shapes and forms that they have, and connect our Clerk OAuth to handle authentication. We then have to import these and define our endpoint inside of our Next.js app and our tools that we are exposing to LLM applications. So for example, here we have a tool that gets the authenticated user's data back into the LLM that's sending this request. So we create this endpoint inside of our app under transport and route.ts. That's how you expose route handlers or API endpoints in Next.js.
Yep.
And we are exporting two things from here. We're creating two things. One is this create MCP handler from the Vercel SDK that Jeff explained how it handles the requests in the way that comes or is expected
Yeah.
from
Yep.
the MCP protocol. And then the auth wrapper is just taking that handler and checking for Clerk token. So it verifies that it's authenticated. And this is not where we define the scopes. This is just us receiving a token from the request and verifying if this is coming from, it is Clerk initiated token.
Yep. And again, this is also provider agnostic, right? This example is working with Clerk because I work at Clerk and I think it does a good job of this. But like within the body of this function, if you had done your own auth or using some other provider, you would just need to make sure that that provider had correctly implemented OAuth 2.1 and other extensions that are required by the MCP spec and give back the token and verify the token. And I think even this code will be smoothed out substantially over time. The required true argument probably shouldn't exactly be there. And the resource metadata path also should be kind of defaulted over time. But this is about
For
as
now.
clean as we can get it. And at 41 lines, like I'm pretty pleased with this because what's happening under the hood here is a whole lot more than 41 lines, but this will still work really well.
All right.
And then up above here is the actual tool, right? So you can see in that function under create MCP handler, you can call server.tool. And this is straight from the MCP spec, like how you define a tool. So the first line is the name of the tool. The second one's a description. The third line, which is empty here, is the arguments that can be passed to that tool. A tool could be roll a dice for me, and you could supply a parameter of how many sides you want the dice to be. So then you would ask, like, hey, Claude, roll a 10-sided dice for me. And Claude would infer the parameter sides as 10 and pass that in here for you. But this, for this example, it was just like get the clerk user data as a proof of concept, so there's no arguments. And then inside this function body, starting on line 17, this is, you just write your tool, right? And so this is where you would normally like delegate your logic to your API endpoints. And then under the return is the format that it sort of expects back, which is not JSON, it's text, because LLMs interact in natural language. And so again, this is just a pure proof of concept demo. So we just stringified the user data. It interprets that. And if you try it out, which I'm guessing you're going to do at some point in the future, you'll see that it gives you a really nice summary of all of the user properties. But ultimately, you probably would want to massage this into a natural language response of what you would want the LLM to receive as an answer to its question that's asking.
Mhm. All right. So we have set the endpoint, and now we want to secure. I guess part of this thing that we did here
Yeah, that's the
was
second
this.
thing we talked about.
Yeah, yes. So we've already done that. And we need to have some metadata endpoints because that's what the specification requires. Some well-known endpoints for your protected resources and authorization
Yeah.
server.
Happy to go into more detail on that if you want, or we can just gloss over it.
Let's gloss over it
Yep.
because let's understand what this is, protected resources. I
Yep.
know this authorization server is required for the older versions of MCP.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So I have a post that might be helpful if there is anyone who wants to like dig into the details on this called How OAuth Works. That's on Clerk's blog that goes through all these details. Again, not in a way that's specific to Clerk, but the OAuth is its own protocol, and we spend a lot of time working with it. And so just wanted to write a little more detail about it. But the general flow of how it goes is like the like mermaid diagram-esque flow is like, imagine you are Claude and you're going to example like let's just use Gmail again, right? I think it's the OAuth authorization code flow in action. If you click on that section in the sidebar, that goes through this here. Yeah. Here it is. So this one uses Twitter. I guess we'll use that example. So let's say you have an app that wants to get Twitter data. It would make a request for that data, and if it didn't require auth, you would send it back, like you were talking about earlier. We're good. You want the data? Here's the data. If it does require auth, it sends you back a 401, which is unauthorized. But alongside with a 401, which makes sense, right? It sends this header called www authenticate that you can see in step 1 here. And this gives you details about like, okay, you were not authorized to access this data, but here's how you can go about getting authorization to access the data. And so it passes through this resource metadata thing here that has a URL that you can probably recognize from the last page that we're on. And for any given API route, what's expected is that it has a well-known path that tells you what you would need in order to get token in order to access that data. And so if you're going to this slash MCP endpoint, it would be root URL slash dot well known slash OAuth protected resource slash MCP. And since that's like a defined URL scheme, you know where to go for it. So on your authorization server, since you got denied, you would say, all right, well, let's go see if I can get the access that I need. And you would make a request to that URL and it gives you back this metadata, which basically just tells you, here's where to go for OAuth. And you can see I marked the line below as the important part right here. This is the like OAuth authorization server. Then you go to the OAuth authorization server to request a second URL, which is the OAuth authorization server endpoint. And as you mentioned, there are older versions that asked you to provide that from your MCP service. At this point, if you have built in an OAuth server to your MCP service, it may well be from the same place. But that certainly isn't necessary. And oftentimes you won't want to like build a custom OAuth provider into MCP. You would want your auth provider to be part of your actual app because it controls access to your app's API endpoints as well as your MCP endpoints. So then it goes for a second metadata file, which tells it what the URL is to start the authorization process. Why there are two metadata files and two hops back and forth is like, I don't think we need to go down that road at the moment. There is a somewhat reasonable reason for it. So this URL here, the authorization endpoint, is where you can make a request to go get an auth token. And so at this point, if you are implementing Claude, for example, you would go get this metadata file, see this URL, you get back your 401, you'd say, okay, MCP says that I need to authorize, so I'm going to go open this URL for my user and add some parameters to it, like who I am and like what access I'm requesting. And at that point, it will show them the consent screen. When they hit yes, it does the whole OAuth dance, and then it comes back and it gives Claude an access token for the things it needs to access. And then Claude would replay the original request that it got denied on, but send the access token as well. And in theory, if everything went well, it will get back what it wanted. And so that sort of is like the whole back and forth. It's a lot of back and forth, right? You go for it, even if you know that you're going to get denied, go for it anyway, right? Get back the information about where to get the token, do the token exchange, and then replay the original request with your token and get back the data that you're after. Now, every subsequent request, since you have an access token, you can just use the access token and not have to go through this whole thing again, right? This is just on the first attempt, unless your access token is expired or the access gets revoked or like whatever. Now, in the future, you would just send the request to the access token and you wouldn't get a 401, you just get the data back.
All right. So
And the
that's the
access token
whole,
is bound to the user because the user is the one who saw the consent screen, right? And clicked
yes.
accept. So when it comes
Yeah.
back, the access token is tied to that user ID. And therefore, when your app gets the access token, it knows what user's data is being asked for. And it would return only that user's data rather than whatever it wants.
Yeah. So that's the OAuth scoped permission use case or flow that we know and have used before, which is now sitting
Correct.
underneath the MCP to be able to then access those resources. And that's why we need these well-known endpoints
Yeah.
for the service to get to understand if it is not authenticated or if it needs authorization. This is where it gets that information.
Yeah. The well-known thing is a little bit on the newer side of OAuth requirements. And I think it's a good addition and that the flow makes a lot more sense. But normally, like if you're just given the authorization URL that we got out of the second metadata file, you don't need to do the whole dance where you make the failed request and go get the two metadata files, because the goal of that whole dance was just to get that authorization URL. So it is also a thing in OAuth that like if you know the authorization URL for the service already and you have a button that says connect to this service, you could just have it go straight there. The benefit of this is that like when you make a request, like different endpoints within your API may require different permissions, or they may in fact use different authorization services. You know, who knows how you've set up your app. And so It's also possible that like maybe you make a change to your authorization service, maybe you make a change to one of your URLs. So this way is like much easier to heal through and more pure because you make the request for the data that you intend to get, and then you rely on the authorization server to tell you what do you need and where do you need to go to get it, and then you can go get it, rather than like going to their docs, trying to look up what you need and where you're going to go to get it, and then like hard coding that into your app. If you do that, it probably will work, but it's not as robust of a like software engineering flow because if anything changes, your integration breaks. Whereas with this scheme, if anything changes, your integration will be fine because you'll get back the 401, right? And then it will go through and rediscover like now you need more scopes to access this, or now we made a change to our authorization service and you need to go to this place instead to get a token, and it will just work and it won't produce an error. It'll just auto heal through that. So like this is
Makes
a
sense.
relatively new set of standards that were layered on top of OAuth. They're not required to conform to the OAuth spec, but they are required in the MCP spec. And I think this is kind of like an interesting dynamic because OAuth, as I mentioned, was created more than a decade ago. And in that time period, the like developers have recognized some things that could have been better about OAuth, and written specs around those things, like this well-known OAuth protected resource and authorization server flow, which I think is an improvement. But there was no pressure for anyone to adopt it. Like OAuth is OAuth. OAuth plus this authorization metadata scheme is like maybe this server doesn't support it, maybe this client doesn't expect it. There's not really any reason to implement it, so you just use regular OAuth. Whereas the MCP project is something that people really want to adopt and implement, and so it sort of becomes this wedge for folks working on Auth who care about Auth flows and OAuth flows to put in more modern OAuth standards as a requirement, and then people start adopting it, which I think is really interesting. I feel like there's probably a lot of different opinions on that. But you know, as a complete and total auth nerd at this point, like I'm a fan of moving forward and pushing for more resilient and more secure OAuth implementations. There are a lot of ways that OAuth, as it was defined more than a decade ago, could be improved. And so I'm really glad that this is happening. But some people are a little bit annoyed by it. And I could see why, because it makes changes are required on both ends. If you are a client who's asking for data from OAuth, you need to make this change where you expect to get back this 401 and you get back that URL and you go to the URL and you fetch something, right? Like you got to change your code. And if you're an authorization server, you need to expose these metadata files as well. So it's a step forward, but it does require additional work. Sorry, that
Yeah.
was a big rabbit hole, but hopefully it's
Yeah,
interesting.
no, it's very interesting, for me, because the way that you describe it is that now it's kind of decoupled, where your authorization server might have some changes in future, but you have like one central location to announce where
Right,
people need to go to
exactly.
get authorized. And I can see similarities for this kind of architecture also in the MCP, where if you have an API and your API changes, well, a developer has to go through the documentation, realizes that the API has changed, go to a different version, and I don't know, hard code it there. Whereas through MCP, if they're making that call there, it's dynamic. It tells what tools do you have.
Yes.
Like the implementation can change, but the tool is like, I have these tools, so they can make a tool call. So this,
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
like the architecture of a lot. I think it's really cool. And you know, yeah, for exactly that reason, I feel like it's just a more resilient piece of architecture that strengthens the implementation of OAuth. Even if some folks might be a little bit peeved about the fact that they have to actually implement it. Luckily, if you're using Clerk, shameless plug, we've already done it for you. So like it's just, you know, like, and generally that's our scheme is like we're in deep on OAuth, like very very deep at this point. And we're well aware of like what all the shortcomings are of it, where there are areas that are possibly insecure or could be taken advantage of for phishing, and we're well aware of what specs have been developed in order to cover over those problems and improve them. And we're working on building in support for each one of those things in such a way that you are not forced into using it, in such a way that if you have a client that doesn't expect them or support them, it won't break. But if you have one that does support them, you can turn it on with Clerk, and now you've got a better, more secure or more resilient OAuth flow. And so that's what we're gunning for with our like overall roadmap, is just like being really plugged in on that stuff, being really thoughtful about it, being really involved in the OAuth and MCP like working group and community of people who are working on that stuff, which we have been in general, which is cool. And making sure that like what we're providing for our customers is like as good as possible in as many situations as we can get away with it being that.
Awesome. So to implement these endpoints, we also get some helpers from Clerk, so that makes it
Yes.
easy for us to
Yeah,
just
those are the things
expose.
you can just run it into your API endpoint and it will spit out that metadata file for you, pre-configured, one
All
shot.
right.
And you can see how easy this is, right? You don't have to think
Yeah.
about the properties of the metadata file. You don't have to fill them in. You just put in basically a stub API endpoint and we just do it for you.
All right. So that's what I had done here, created this felt known, and then
Yep.
two endpoints inside authorization server and the protected resources that has the MCP, basically
Perfect. Yep.
copy and paste from the documentation. And then here
Exactly.
I just copied this metadata
Yeah.
handler from Clerk as well. And
And we're also
that
planning
is,
on having an option into our middleware that will just automatically serve those routes without you having to create a folder. That's something
mhm,
that's been on our roadmap too. Then it would just take one or two extra steps away.
yeah,
But by any means, like if you would like to expose them yourselves, we're going to make sure that that's an option if you want to have granular control over it.
I see. All right, so this is what we needed on our end inside of our Next.js app to
Oh,
expose this transport or MCP
yeah.
server endpoint.
It's like under
Um,
100 lines. We're really happy with this result. It took a really long time to trim it down to that amount of code. A really long time, but like we're really happy with how it came out.
all right, so this is the Clerk Authentication Starter. That's the app that we're going to set up in hopefully another video. And once you log in, you just have a dashboard that shows in the
Yep.
information about the logged in user. And now in this app, we have the MCP server integration. So let's go to that part of the implementation where
Yeah, let's run
we are
it.
now connecting an MCP compatible client to our server.
Okay.
So it's
Yeah. So
Command Shift P.
cursor settings is that little gear on the top right section. Cool. Yeah, you found tools and integrations. That's the way. Add custom MCP right there.
Mhm.
And that's where you can drop in the config from the docs. Just paste it over the whole thing. Yep, that should do it. And now if you go back to the cursor settings from the top right, and you go to tools and integrations, there it is. So it says needs login. You can click on that and open that right on up. And then we see our consent screen, which is nice. All right, then it will open back into cursor. You got to click open there. And there we're connected up and we have one tool enabled. So now if you hit Command I, it will open the AI chat in cursor. And you could just say, get me my clerk user data or something like that. And it should be able to figure out what tool to call based on this. Oh, what is that? Oh, this
I
is
don't
you
know.
having to log into cursor. I should be able to do that with your clerk account, I think. Or yeah, if you already have an existing one. Yep, log that right in. Cool. Let's see if it'll, I think you might have to send that message again. There it is. It found the
Call
tool.
it
You
tool.
run the tool. It always asks you for permission before running tools. And there it is. There's all of your clerk user data. That's
Beautiful.
the full flow. Obviously, it's just a demo, but like any other tools you wanted to write, you would be able to add in through that server.tool call. And I will have to go fix that VS Code thing. So good to know. I'll be on it.
Absolutely. All right. So end to end, we created the MCP server endpoint inside of our Next.js application, added Clerk authentication to it, and then used it inside of an LLM-based application like the Cursor code to be able to fetch the user data, but you can expand on whatever other tool and resources you want to expose via this MCP server. All right,
Yep,
cool. This was end
it's
to end,
cool.
really nice.
And we've had several Clerk customers build out custom MCP servers already for their applications and deploy them to production. In fact, we had several customers do so before we even launched the feature, which is really cool and also tells you a lot about how eager folks are to get in front of this need from users. So it was really great to see, folks would reach out to us about this. We ran them through our early access program. And by the time we even announced the feature, they already had delivered it, which is awesome. So it's really great to see. Looking forward to working more on MCP stuff and seeing where it evolves. But we're really pumped about it, and yeah, really happy to see it moving forward. And we'll do our best to support it. If anyone is implementing this with Clerk, definitely let us know. It would be great. And if you're having any issues with it, just drop a note to our support team, and probably I will respond.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for the time.
Yeah,
We're going to have probably more videos around MCPs, maybe project-based videos where we can showcase the other parts of the architecture Jeff was mentioning
absolutely.
earlier that needs to go into your app to be able to expose these tools via the MCP protocol and authentication with Clerk. As this is developing, we're going to have more content around it for sure. And we're going to have Jeff coming back for more videos here.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
All right, great. So that's a wrap for today. If you have any questions, like always, hit them up down in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.